Urgent question. Dame Priti Patel, Shadow Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs if he'll make a statement on the Government's response to the decision taken by the ICC to issue arrest warrants in respect of the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Mr. Speaker, last Thursday, judges of the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, and for the reportedly deceased Mohammed Ibrahim al-Masri, commonly known as Daif, Commander-in-Chief of the military wing of Hamas. The ICC is the primary international institution for investigating and prosecuting the most serious crimes of international concern. It is actively investigating allegations of the gravest crimes in countries around the world, including Ukraine, Sudan, and Libya. In line with this government's stated commitment to the rule of law, we respect the independence of the ICC. We will comply with our international obligations. There is a domestic legal process through our independent courts that determines whether or not to endorse an arrest warrant by the ICC in accordance with the ICC Act of 2001. This process has never been tested because the UK has never been visited by an ICC indictee. If there were to be such a visit to the UK, there would be a court process and due process would be followed in relation to those issues. There is no moral equivalence between Israel, a democracy, and Hamas and Lebanese Hezbollah, two terrorist organisations. This government has been clear. Israel has a right to defend itself in accordance with international law. That right is not under question, Mr. Speaker, and the Court's approval of the warrants last week do not change that. Israel is, of course, a partner across UK priorities, including trade, investment, security, and science and technology. We do cooperate across a wide range of issues for our mutual benefit. This government remains focused, Mr. Speaker, on pushing for an immediate ceasefire to bring an end to the devastating violence in Gaza. This is essential to protect civilians, ensure the release of hostages, and to increase humanitarian aid into Gaza. We have always said diplomacy is what will see an end to this conflict, and that can only be achieved through dialogue. It is in the long-term interest of the Israelis, Palestinians, and the wider region to agree to a ceasefire deal urgently and bring this devastating conflict to an end.
Shadow Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the International Criminal Court's decision to issue arrest warrants for the State of Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and its former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant will do nothing to help secure the release of those poor hostages who've been held captive by Hamas for over a year. Nor will it help to get more aid into Gaza, and it will not deliver a sustainable end to this awful conflict. And in charging Israeli leaders alongside Hamas, the ICC appears to be drawing a moral equivalence between Israel's war of self-defence and Hamas terrorism. We utterly reject any moral equivalence. The only beneficiaries of this decision are Hamas and their terrorist sponsors, Iran, who are now celebrating this propaganda coup as a great victory for Hamas and Hezbollah. Since the ICC's decision, we have had dither from ministers and confused messaging and no clarity, so I'm grateful to the Minister today for his remarks. So the Government has indicated already that it will seek to enforce these warrants through our own courts, and there is a process around that. And as to the issue of warrants, we have raised serious concerns over process, jurisdiction, and the position on complementarity principle, and believe the warrants of Mr Netanyahu and Gallant have no basis in international law. So does the Government believe the Court has jurisdiction in this case, given that Israel is not party to the Rome Statute and Palestine is not a recognised state? Does the Minister agree that the ICC must act within legal norms? And in the absence of the ICC making public the specific context of the charges, does the Minister share concerns expressed about reports of process errors in the ICC's investigation and the concerns that Lord MacDonald, the former DPP, has raised about the use by the prosecutor of an expert panel? And finally, but crucially, what effect does the Minister believe that Mr Netanyahu's immunity under international law as a serving Prime Minister of a country which is not a state party has on enforcing these warrants in the UK's own courts? Mr. Speaker, these are important questions. I look forward to the Minister responding. But it is really important that at this time when there is such a conflict taking place, the Minister has already spoken about securing the release of hostages, more aid coming into Gaza, that we have clear clarity from this government. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the questions from my right honourable friend across the benches. It is, of course, utmost in this government's mind the need to bring an immediate end to the conflict in Gaza, to secure the release of the hostages whose families I have met, and I know the right honourable friend knows that I'm familiar with these issues from my previous life. We also, of course, need to see more aid going into Gaza, and the questions at issue with the ICC are separate from that. Diplomacy will continue regardless of the process of the ICC, but I had understood it to be the common position of this House that the international rule of law is an important commitment. The International Criminal Court is the primary body in enforcing these norms, and the issues on jurisdiction and complementarity were heard by the pre-trial chamber. Its 3 judges have issued their findings, and I think we should respect those.
Chair of the Select Committee, Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The International Criminal Court was created when 120 countries put their names to the Rome Statute and signed up to the principle that certain basic standards of behaviour must be enforced internationally. And those laws would be applicable to everyone, no matter who they were. From the time when Winston Churchill led the party opposite, this country has been a proud supporter of international law, and it is wrong for us to try to undermine it. Does my honourable friends share my deep disappointment that the Conservatives have fallen as far as they have?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I think has been clear from the actions of this government from July when we became the government, the international rule of law is incredibly important to this government, and all of our actions will be guided by it.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Calum Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The conflict between Israel and Hamas has had a devastating impact on Palestinian and Israeli civilians, with women and children paying a particularly terrible price. Now that the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for those it believes are culpable, the UK indeed has obligations under international law that we must uphold. The previous Conservative government chose to be selective with those obligations when it came to the ICC's jurisdiction in the occupied Palestinian territories. That was deeply regrettable and damaging for our country, and I greatly regret that the Conservative front bench are pursuing the same line today. It is right that the government has committed to uphold this ruling, and I welcome the Minister's statement that it will support the process to enforce these arrest warrants. But does the Minister share my concern about the words of Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who has proposed sanctioning nations, including the UK, who uphold this ruling? And can the Minister outline the specific new steps the government is taking to secure an immediate bilateral ceasefire with all parties, so we can put a stop to the humanitarian disaster in Gaza, get the hostages home, and open the door to a two-state solution?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Every member of this government, most particularly the Foreign Secretary and the rest of the Foreign Office ministerial team, are engaged every day, including this morning, in pressing all parties for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, for an immediate ceasefire in Lebanon, and for a de-escalation of violence, of course, in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories, but also more broadly in the Middle East, where violence remains far too high.
Andy Slaughter.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for the Prime Minister of a democratic state, which is a UK ally, finding there are reasonable grounds that he is responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Doesn't that call for action as well as words from the UK government, which might include ending trade with illegal settlements, the sanctioning of members of the government and settlers, and indeed the recognition of the state of Palestine, if we are to show not only our disapproval, but how we want to move forward?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I recognise the long commitment to these issues from my honourable friends. I will not comment further, as you'd expect, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the ICC process, which needs to now carry through in accordance with due process and in the way that you would expect And on the issues of sanctions, which have been discussed in this chamber before, I'm not at liberty to provide any further commentary on who we might consider for sanctions in the usual way.
Oliver Dowden.
And whatever reservations one may have about the conduct of the conflict in Gaza, there are two fundamental principles. One, Netanyahu is a democratically elected leader of a sovereign state, and two, that state is conducting a legitimate war of self-defence. Now, the Minister acknowledges those facts, but does he not appreciate how this ruling is seen as an affront to those principles by many of my constituents?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm slightly stumped by the questions opposite. We're signatories to the ICC Act. I think the whole House agrees with the importance of the rule of law. Representations have been made to the ICC in the pre-trial chamber, and they have found they have come to their decisions. I think we should respect their independence.
Tan Singh Dhesi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I find it shocking but not surprising that the Conservative Party has chosen to downgrade and disparage the highly respected International Criminal Court. We're a nation that upholds the rule of law, so I am very proud that the new Labour government has chosen to respect the independence of the ICC. With ICC arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant and Mohammed Deif, who, on the basis that there are reasonable grounds that they bear criminal responsibility for potential war crimes, does the Minister agree that it is important that we respect the independence of that ICC judgment and that, if required, we implement the said finding?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not really able to go much further than to say that there is a domestic legal process through our independent courts that would determine whether or not to endorse an arrest warrant. We would follow the due process in the way that you would expect, and this is a decision not for government ministers but for an independent court.
David Davies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister may be aware I've fought the corner for international courts time and time again in this House, and I view upholding the authority of those courts and the reputation of those courts as very important. The difficulty here is not just that Israel is a democracy, but it has an internal independent judiciary, which puts a limit on what any government can do in Israel, which is why equating or appearing to equate Netanyahu with all the other monsters that the International Criminal Court has quite properly prosecuted risks bringing the court into disrepute.
Where's the limit?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know that the Right Honourable Member has looked at these issues over a long period of time. Questions of complementarity are, of course, important, and I understand they were considered by the pre-trial chamber.
Florence Eshamole.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Several of our allies and international partners have outlined their commitment fully supporting the ICC, including Canada, the Netherlands, Sweden, Belgium and Ireland. So I welcome the government's commitment in respecting the independence of the ICC. Does the Minister agree that the ICC has a very high evidential threshold when it comes to the issuing of arrest warrants for alleged perpetrators? And has this now not been demonstrated with this case?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The deliberations of the ICC on this matter have gone on for some time, and I think it's been clear for all to see the way in which they proceeded, and I welcome them.
Leila Moran.
Last week I attended a memorial service for the people of Gaza with families of Palestinian origin here in the UK. I believe the ministers met with some of those representatives already. And we heard from a woman called Calum, who described how overnight she lost 48 members of her family. And she, as she walked back, sat behind me and broke down in sobs as she remembered so painfully that day. She deserves justice. This issuing of a warrant is not justice. There is still a process to go through, there is still a trial to be had. But is it not right that whatever the court, those outcomes are adhered to? So might I press him on the ruling of the ICJ advisory opinion? on the occupation, because at the core of this is that ruling. And that should mean that we are doing much more than just meeting with those families and sharing in their pain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the honourable member alludes, I've met with these families as well, and many other families who have been so wounded by the conduct of this conflict over the course of the last year on both sides, both the hostage families and the many, many Palestinians and Lebanese who've seen their lives so cruelly turned upside down. As I said earlier, in the end, it is only diplomacy that will bring an end to this conflict. We will continue to have contact with all sides, including those indicted. We will continue to press all those with whom we engage to bring an early end to this war. In relation to the ICJ, we've set out our position before. We are considering the judgment carefully. We've provided an explanation of our position so far in the United Nations. It is an important, far-reaching judgment, and we hope to be able to say more in due course.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Minister's confirmation that the UK will be upholding the ICC arrest warrants for the Hamas general and Israeli leaders. The ICC found grounds to believe that Netanyahu and Gallant each bear criminal responsibility for the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare and the crimes against humanity of murder, persecution and other humane acts. It goes on to say the crime of intentionally directing an attack against the civilian population. On that last point, what moral justification is there now for continuing arms sales used by Israeli forces at the behest of a Prime Minister accused of such serious war crimes? When will we use every diplomatic lever to stop the killing, free all hostages and stop selling arms to a country led by someone accused of such horrific war crimes?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to just be clear that what I've said this afternoon is not that the government will uphold arrest warrants. What I have been clear about this afternoon is that due process will be followed. These are questions for independent courts in the UK, and it is independent courts that would review the arrest warrants if that situation were to arise. My honourable friend asks about aid. I want to be absolutely clear, insufficient aid is getting into Gaza. I travelled myself to the Gaza border and saw the restrictions Israel is putting on aid reaching Gaza. Those restrictions have been called out by me and other members of the Foreign Office day in, day out. We are taking steps with our partners and our allies to try and ensure that those in Gaza have the aid that they need as winter comes in order to survive. These are grave matters, and I understand the frustration of right across this House that we have not seen the amount of aid in Gaza that we would like to see. And I recognise that people are asking for yet more to be done. We, of course, in relation to the specific question about the arms licence suspensions that were announced to this House on the 2nd of September, we will, of course, keep that under review, and we will consider the findings of the ICC in relation to that assessment.
Stephen Flynn.
Speaker, last year the Labour Party had to be dragged into accepting that there was a collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Indeed, the honourable gentleman's boss said that war is ugly. The Labour Party earlier this year had to be dragged into even uttering the words ceasefire. So can I ask him, will he show the leadership that his bosses failed to do and say that if Benjamin Netanyahu's feet touch the ground in the UK, you will comply with the arrest warrant?
Sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think I wasn't quite quick enough on my feet. The honourable member says with dismay, war is ugly. War is ugly. And we are doing everything that we can to bring it to a close through all of the diplomatic measures that you would expect. This is not an issue for grandstanding. This is an issue for diplomacy. And that is what this government is committed to.
Apsana Begum.
Surely central to the debate today must be the UK's ongoing
political role as Israel's close ally, and the fact that UK-made weapons, including components, are still being used by Israel? Does the Minister recognise that beyond the commitment to uphold the ICC's arrest warrants, the UK's failure to clearly condemn the collective punishment of civilians, an intent explicitly indicated by key Israeli leading figures, and the continued military support for Israel's ongoing onslaught in Gaza have serious implications for the UK's own human rights obligations and the fate of millions of innocent men, women and children?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the my honourable friend for her question. I won't rehearse too much the answers provided on the 2nd of September and on numerous occasions in this chamber since then. We have suspended, with one exemption, which I'm happy to turn to again, all of the arms that we are selling to Israel that could be used in Gaza. That suspension, in our assessment, also covers the West Bank and Lebanon. We are taking action in accordance with our commitments under international humanitarian law, and we will continue to do so.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Deputy Speaker, can we be absolutely clear about what the government is saying? Because it seems the government is not saying there would be an automatic arrest should Benjamin Netanyahu arrive in this country, that there would be due process. And could he confirm that customarily international law does not permit the arrest or the delivering of the Prime Minister of a non-state party to the ICC? So he's committing to due process, but he's not committing to arrest. Am I correct in understanding that?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's a domestic legal process through our independent courts. We cannot prejudge that process. I note that the Shadow Attorney General has written to the Attorney General on questions of detail in relation to some of the points you allude to, and the Attorney General tells me he will be writing back on those more detailed points.
Nasha.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whilst we watch, we work tirelessly to get a ceasefire in Gaza, which is really important simply because the children don't see an end in sight, neither do the families in Gaza. Does the Minister also agree with me that Britain's reputation on the world scene as a global leader for upholding justice would be undermined if Britain did not respect the independence of the ICC, as those on the Conservative benches are implying?
Madam Deputy Speaker, this government thinks that adherence to international law and being seen to adhere to international law is incredibly important, and in everything we've done since July, we have sought to underline that principle, and I would hope that it would be one that the whole House would support us in.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister has assured us that the arrest warrants will be carried out, and I hope that is the case. Could he also consider that if an arrest warrant has been issued for the leader of a country, if the International Court of Justice has found it deeply wanting on its behaviour and as an occupying power and the war crimes that have been committed, why are we still supplying weapons that are taking part in the bombardment of Gaza that are destroying life as we speak?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I said in answer to a question from my own benches, we took steps on the 2nd of September to ensure that, with one exemption, which I'm happy to go into, that we are not selling arms which are being used, which could pose a breach of international humanitarian law in Gaza, and that continues to be the position, and it is kept under regular review.
Abtisam Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The ICC's decision is a crucial step to ensuring justice and accountability for the crimes against humanity committed in Gaza and Israel. It is vital that the government acts without fear or favour in order to uphold the international rules-based system. War crimes are wrong, whoever commits them and wherever they happen, whether by Russian forces in unlawfully occupied Ukraine or by Israeli forces in an unlawfully occupied Palestinian territory. Will the Minister now review all diplomatic, economic and political relations with Israel to ensure our country is not complicit with the atrocities taking place in Gaza, the West Bank and in Lebanon?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I can confirm that the Department keeps its and the Government as a whole keeps its international obligations under close review, including in relation to the theatres described.
Monica Harding. Madam Deputy Speaker, last week I was in the West Bank and saw for myself the incursions by settlers into the occupied Palestinian territories, following recent comments from Israel's far-right Finance Minister, Bezalel Smotrich, describing in explicit terms the active effort to annex the West Bank to Israel. Does the Minister agree that now is the time to sanction Smotrich?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the comments of Finance Minister Smotrich have been condemned in this chamber before, and we can reiterate those condemnations. But as my friend would expect, we cannot put comment on sanctions which may or may not be under consideration in the usual way.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm no friend of Hamas, but we must remember that Prime Minister Netanyahu promised us intelligence-led precision attacks in Gaza. What we've seen is daily violation of international law, 43,000 people killed, restrictions on food aid, 136 journalists killed. So I welcome the government and its announcement to respect the ICC's decision. But can I urge us also to consider all levers, including sanctions against 2 of the Israeli government ministers, and also sanctions against the settlers in the West Bank and other organisations operating therein.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will not comment on what sanctions may be under review for reasons which are well established, but I would draw my honourable friend's attention to the sanctions that we have already taken in October against Israeli settlers and organisations involved in both breaches of international law and violence in the West Bank.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our closest ally is the United States of America, and there has been widespread condemnation of these arrest warrants being issued by across both the House of Representatives and Congress. What effect does the Minister think this decision will have on our relationship with the United States of America, particularly with the new incoming administration, which has very different views?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK is a state party to the Rome Statute, and this brings with it obligations that put us in a different position from the US. We will, of course, continue to engage both with the current and the incoming US administration in the shared interests of our 2 countries across the full range of our priorities.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The atrocities that led to the issuing of the arrest warrants continue to this day, not least in healthcare facilities, where we see the devastating stories coming out of Gaza. However, my honourable friend has set out his frustration at aid not reaching those very facilities, and yet there is more sanction that could be applied by this government. So why will he not escalate now the UK's response to the Israeli government by placing those sanctions so they really feel the real pain of our country, but also understand that we want to ensure that justice is served by the ICC?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to reassure the House how focused the government is on the question of aid access into Gaza. As I say, I've travelled to the region and I've raised these issues repeatedly with all parties, including the Israeli government. We need to see a flood of aid into Israel. That is what has been the commitment of the Israeli government, and I regret that we have not yet seen that flood of aid and that Palestinians are suffering as a consequence. Winter is coming, and Palestinians in Gaza are extremely vulnerable, and we will continue to press the Israeli government to do everything that it can to ensure that more aid reaches Gaza and indeed into all parts of the occupied Palestinian territories that require it. I made these points forcefully this morning, and I will continue to make them.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
The ICC has issued arrest warrants for crimes including direct attacks on civilians. Open source information shows that the RAF reconnaissance flights are going over Gaza and average nearly 4 flights a day. While, of course, we all seek the information necessary to gain the release of the hostages, how confident is he that the information used and shared with Israel from these flights has not been used to facilitate any attacks on civilians?
Good question. Good question.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will not go into operational details, but I can assure the House these surveillance aircraft are unarmed, do not have a combat role, and are tasked solely to locate hostages, including a British national, and they will continue to do so.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In response to the Right Honourable Member for Witham, I note that the UK, under the previous Conservative government, signed an ICC state party statement in support of the ICC and to preserve it from political interference just before the election. And the Foreign Secretary has confirmed the UK's acceptance and respect for the ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu's war crimes. Therefore, isn't it now incumbent on the government to take effective, concrete steps to prevent further such acts by banning all arms licences to Israel, including F-35 parts, and imposing sanctions on individuals, on assets, goods trading with the illegally occupied West Bank, and the urgent recognition of Palestinian statehood?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I won't rehearse the points that we've already discussed on sanctions. The Foreign Secretary set out our position both in relation to the suspension of arms licences and the F-35 exemptions, and that remains the position. We will keep our assessments under regular review, including the findings of the ICC.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Deputy Madam Speaker. Frankly, I'm disappointed. The government isn't giving any clear responses. I therefore ask you, in October 2023, over 800 experts in international law and conflicts and genocide studies, they gave a warning of clear prospects of genocide. In November 2023, over 40 United Nations experts called it a genocide in the making. Then we get the ICJ judgment that called it a plausible genocide. And then we had a judge from the ICJ saying the alarm has now been sounded by the court. All the indicators of genocidal activities are flashing red in Gaza. And now we have an arrest warrant. Does this government stand by its conviction that genocide is not being committed in Gaza? Yes or no?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think it's important that we treat the international institutions with the respect that they deserve. This is an indictment from the ICC, and we respect it. The ICJ, the process that you refer to, has not found. It is in an advisory opinion stage, and we need to treat international law with the respect that it deserves.
Imran Hussain.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and the Minister will be aware that, as well as the ICC's recent decision to issue arrest warrants, there is now an entire body of international law, including the ICJ advisory opinion adopted by the UN General Assembly ruling Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories illegal, and South Africa's case at the ICJ on genocide, that points towards a very clear position in international law. Does the Minister therefore agree that if we are to preserve the integrity of the international rules-based order, then we must start by ending the international hypocrisy and double standards and reaffirm that all states, including the UK, have an absolute obligation under international law to act now to bring all those who commit war crimes to justice?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question. I want to underline this government's commitments to ending accountability for war crimes, and we stand against international crimes of this nature in all places, everywhere, and our commitment to international law is one of the most powerful levers we have in trying to prevent war crimes.
Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I asked for the Minister's forgiveness because I didn't hear whether he answered this question to my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. But is it his understanding that under customary international law, it does not permit the arrest or delivery of a serving Prime Minister of a non-state party to the ICC? and that the UK seeking to arrest the Prime Minister would not only breach our international obligations, but would also be unlawful under the ICC Act 2001.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. For the awareness of the House, the Shadow Attorney-General has written about the two different legal interpretations of immunity and sought the Attorney-General's view on these matters. I think the Shadow Attorney-General is acknowledging that this would be a case that courts would be the competent authority on, but he has undertaken to respond to that letter, and he will do in due course.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The law is the law and the evidence is the evidence. Whether it's politically convenient, whether it helps us diplomatically or not, the law is the law. The International Criminal Court has been absolutely clear on what they think. Can I just say to my honourable friend, the Minister, that he is absolutely right to reject the calls opposite, to turn this into a political decision and to leave this as an independent legal decision for our courts and for the International Criminal Court, and he should carry on exactly the way he is.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I agree.
Caroline Verdon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the decision by the ICC, and I sincerely hope that we will live up to our international obligations if the Prime Minister of Israel visits the UK. You have said yourself that you regret the fact that more aid isn't getting into Gaza and that you've been calling out the Israeli government for not letting more aid in. Is it not time now to do more than just calling out the Israeli government and telling them how angry you are? Isn't it time now that you end all arms exports to Israel, that you impose sanctions, end trade with all the illegal settlements and recognise Palestine as a state?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We will continue to press these points with vigour, and we will continue to keep all of the other measures under review, as I've said already in this chamber.
Before I call the next speaker, can I just remind members not to use the word you? I call Melanie Ward.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I thought the Conservative Party styled itself as the party of law and order, but that's increasingly not the case when it comes to international law, it seems. The government is right to uphold the decision of the ICC, and it was right to vote for the UN Security Council motion on a ceasefire last week. The Minister will be aware that there is increasing evidence of forcible displacement of Palestinians from the north of Gaza, including from organisations such as Human Rights Watch. He will be aware that this is a crime against humanity, and that two of the main proponents of this are Israeli Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. The Prime Minister has confirmed that the government is looking at this, so when will the government move to sanction them as part of a wider package of further action to uphold international law?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We follow reports from northern Gaza closely and with concern, and have raised many of these issues repeatedly. As I've said already, I won't comment further on sanctions, but that I wish to be clear that forced displacement of Palestinians outside of Gaza is not consistent with Israel's obligations.
Stephen Geppings.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Minister agree with me that one of the greatest tools that we have against tyranny anywhere is that, friend or foe, rich or poor, elected or unelected, the law applies to everybody, and the universality of certain crimes means that they can be prosecuted anywhere?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I hope I've made clear this afternoon, this government is committed to the international rule of law and will continue to be so.
Sarah Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Despite what the Minister has said, last week at the Royal Courts of Justice, the government conceded that UK-made F-35 parts could be used in violations of international law in Gaza, and admitted that Israel has shown no commitment to upholding these legal obligations. Despite this, the government has continued to authorise offensive F-35 arms exports, exposing itself to criminal liability. It's disappointing that the Foreign Secretary isn't here today, so will the Minister let our constituents know if the government will end its complicity in genocide, impose sanctions and end all arms sales, and will the Minister confirm that should Netanyahu, who faces an ICC arrest warrant for war crimes and crimes against humanity, enter UK territory, he will be immediately arrested? Yes or no?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll return briefly to the statement made by the Foreign Secretary on the 2nd of September. Suspending all licences for the F-35 programme would undermine the global F-35 supply chain that is vital for the security of the UK, our allies and NATO. He set out on the 2nd of September how the suspension of armed licences would apply to direct sale of F-35 components to Israel, but not to the global supply chain. That continues to be the position.
Shirka Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 43,000 dead, possibly 100,000 under the rubble. Schools, hospitals destroyed, and 16,000 children killed, including by drones and shot in the head. Many of my members and honourable friends have mentioned that this was a genocide mentioned many months ago. Now that the ICC prosecutor has called Benjamin Netanyahu a serious war criminal, a potential serious war criminal and committing crimes against humanity, does the Minister agree with me that it is now the time to recognise the State of Palestine and all military and financial cooperation with the Israeli government, while its leaders are essentially international fugitives?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I won't rehearse our position on the recognition of State of Palestine other than to say we believe that the Palestinians have an inalienable right to a state alongside a safe and secure Israel, and as part, this government hopes to take steps to advance that as part of a contribution to a two-state solution. The honourable member suggests no contact at all with the Israeli government, I think, as a consequence of the ICC ruling. It is only diplomacy that will bring an end to this conflict. We will continue to have direct contacts, and in those direct contacts, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will continue to do all that we can to secure an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages, aid into Gaza, and a more safe and secure, stable Middle East.
John MacDonald.
Can I just say to my honourable friend, I say this as constructively as I possibly can, but a number of us have sat here for a number of months and questions have been asked about sanctions, and the response from ministers is that we cannot comment on sanctions in the House. Can I say that renders sanctions ineffective? In addition to that, it breaks down the accountability of ministers to this House as well, and we deserve a better statement than that. Can I also ask him on the legal process itself? He's quite right when he said we will respect international law, we will comply with the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction and decisions. And he said it will be for the, if I get the wording right, it will be for the domestic legal processes involved. Where does physical arrest come within that domestic legal process?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me deal with the question of why we don't provide advance comment on sanctions, and then I'll turn, if I may, to the question about the domestic legal process. So, I hear my right honourable friend. The reason we do not provide commentary on sanctions is that to do so in advance would reduce their effect. I think, and I have my colleague sat next to me, but I would think that we have issued probably upwards of 50, maybe even 100 sanctions in the short time that we've been the government. There has been no shortage of sanctions for this House to comment on. I recognise the two that I've been pressed on the most this afternoon are of intense political interest. But despite their intense political interest, were we to prejudge sanctions and trail them in this House before we made them, we would reduce their impact. The same is true of the hundreds of sanctions that we have done on Russia over the years, and it would be the same in every forum. In relation to the domestic legal process, I hope my right honourable friend will forgive me for not entering too deeply into hypotheticals about how we might, how a court might discharge its findings on these matters.
John Cooper.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. Israel is a democracy, and its courts have in the past shown themselves unafraid to put even senior politicians on trial. What assessment then has the Minister made of the Israelis' own ability to bring human rights cases in their own courts?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is described in international law as the question of complementarity, and it was considered by the pre-trial chamber, and given the independence of the ICC, I don't think it appropriate for me to offer further commentary. Arguments were made by various states on this matter, and the pre-trial chamber came to its findings.
Afzal Khan.
Does the Minister agree that as well as demanding an immediate ceasefire, free all hostages, unhindered aid getting into Gaza, we must ensure that the perpetrators of heinous war crimes and crimes against humanity are held to account under international law, whether they are friend or foe, based on justice that is blind, objective and impartial? Playing politics with courts undermines justice.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. Support for international criminal justice and accountability has traditionally been a matter on which we have had widespread support in this House, and it will continue to be a priority for the British Government.
Ellie Chowns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The ICC, the world's highest criminal court, has reasonable grounds to allege that the Israeli leaders are guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And the other world court, the International Court of Justice, has found there is plausible risk Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians and that Israel's occupation and annexation is unlawful. So may I ask the Minister two questions? First of all, does he agree that the UK has itself obligations under international law to prevent genocide, to bring Israel's unlawful occupation to an end and to bring suspected perpetrators of grave breaches of international law to justice? And second, quite simply, what will the UK do differently as a result of the decisions of the ICC and the ICJ? He says he'll pull out all of the stops. We've had many suggestions here today, including stopping of the export of F-35s. What will the government do differently?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So, does the government accept that we have international obligations? Indeed, we do. I've set out how we would discharge them in relation to the ICC this afternoon. I've set out also the view that we take on the ICJ process. We will continue to do everything that we can to ensure that there is proper international justice which is abided by all. We are one of the ICC's major funders. We commit £13.2 million a year to ensure that the ICC can function properly. In everything that this government does, we are trying to ensure the international rule of law, and we will continue to do so.
Bel Ribeiro Ade.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The UK has a responsibility not just to respect the independence of international courts, but to take active steps to promote compliance with international obligations. Where nations or leaders have been accused of committing war crimes, the UK has held itself as a global leader in placing sanctions. It is unconscionable that in this situation we are yet to stop all sales of arms to Israel. And if Israel is accused of committing war crimes, doesn't the continued sale of any arms to Israel make the UK potentially complicit? Given the gravity of this situation, can the Minister clarify further why he cannot comment on sanctions, or indeed the other steps the government is planning or willing to take to make clear the UK's condemnation of the continued slaughter of civilians in Gaza?
Madam Deputy Speaker, let me comment on arms sales as they've been raised again. I won't rehearse the arguments about the F-35 exemption. In relation to the arms that are sold, or the arms that are licensed to be sold to Israel, there is the category that have been suspended, and that is the category that was that posed a risk to be involved in a risk of breaches of international humanitarian law in Gaza. Those weapons, we also believe, would be the weapons at issue in the West Bank and in Lebanon. There's a second category of weapons that are for resale elsewhere, which are not relevant to events in Israel. There is a third category of weapons where they are used either for defensive purposes or in purposes that I think nobody in this House would disagree. Body armour and helmets for aid workers going into Gaza, for example. I would say gently to colleagues right across the House that there is not, in the rest of the arms sales, some solution to the dilemma that faces us. The suspension of arms sales has been done carefully, aimed at the potential breach of international humanitarian law. It has been reached carefully and judiciously, and including in relation to the F-35. That is the position as it remains.
Neil Shastri-Hurst.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I have a certain degree of sympathy with the Minister who has been asked to substitute in lieu of the Foreign Secretary here today. So I'll ask him a question of fact. Does the Minister recognise that pursuant to Section 23, subsection 6 of the International Criminal Court Act 2001, representatives of a non-state party in the Rome Statute will remain immune from prosecution unless that non-state party expressly waives that right to the ICC?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't need sympathy, just careful listening. It's the same question asked by your colleague, and it's the same answer. This has been raised by the Shadow Attorney General to the Attorney General, and you'll get a letter in due course.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I must press the Minister on this question of F-35 arms sales. The Minister mentions direct and indirect arms sales. The Minister says that the indirect arms sales are either irrelevant or impossible to remedy. As far as I understand it, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is no reason why F-35 parts made in the UK and sold to the United States and then used in Israel cannot be subject to a conditional licence which sees them still sold to the United States on the proviso that they cannot be used in Gaza. So, given this, in what way can it be legally or morally justified to continue allowing UK parts for fighter jets that are being used to kill Palestinian children to be exported, even indirectly, to an Israeli leader facing an arrest warrant for war crimes and crimes against humanity? And we hear about the review, but while the ongoing review has been taking place both under the last government and under this government, thousands and thousands of Palestinian civilians have been killed.
Madam Deputy Speaker, just for clarity on the F-35 programme, we have suspended arms licences where parts for the F-35 programme are sold directly to Israel. Where they are sold to the global spares pool, it is not possible to then disentangle from where they go in that pool to their final destination. That is why we have made the exemptions. That is why we judge that making that exemption is vital for the security of the UK, for our allies and for NATO.
Andrew George.
Madam Deputy Speaker, does the Minister agree that the cold-blooded slaughter of tens of thousands of innocent people in Gaza cannot be justified in terms of self-defence, and contrary to the Trumpian line adopted by the Conservative benches, does the Minister also agree that just because a country is a democracy, it doesn't provide it with an immunity blanket from international law?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The honourable member refers to the terrible loss of life in Gaza, which I know is in the minds and the hearts of this whole House. We are a democracy, as much as signatories to petitions may wish it otherwise. We abide by international law, and we expect our allies to do the same, and we make that point with force.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let's remind this House why we're here. Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant stand accused of very serious crimes. The crime against humanity of murder, the crime against humanity of persecution, and starvation is a weapon of war. 70% of those killed in this war are innocent women and children. Nobody in this House, in living memory, remembers a war where 70% of women and children that are killed are in this war like this. So I would like to ask a very specific question, because you've evaded all of this so far. Can you tell us one concrete step, apart from executing the arrest warrants, as the UK is obliged to do as a state party to their own statute, one concrete step that we can all tangibly grasp after these ICC arrest warrants that you're going to do next? We'd like to hear it now, please. Thank you.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been clear about what it is the government has done and will continue to do, but if the honourable member would like a recap, on the very first morning that I became a minister, we announced the restoration of funding to UNRWA. We have provided significant aid to the people of Gaza. We have provided aid which has not got in to Gaza. We have raised that with the Israelis. Me and my ministerial colleagues have travelled to the region to press these issues, both alone and in company, with the French Foreign Minister. What we face, this House is united in its concern about what will happen in Gaza over the course of December. There is no disagreement that insufficient aid has gone in. There are urgent, almost frantic efforts every day in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office to try to ensure that adequate aid reaches the Palestinians. I understand the frustration of this House. We are working as hard as we can. We will continue to do so. We take concrete action each and every day on this issue.
Tracy Gilbert.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The ICC found that there is no justification under international humanitarian law for the restrictions of aid by the Israeli government. Indeed, the ICC detailed how doctors have been forced to carry out treatments and amputations without anaesthetics, including on children. The government's response must include redoubling our efforts to get more aid into Gaza. Can my right honourable friend confirm what pressure is being put on the Israeli government, in addition to what we've already done, to get more aid into Gaza?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In addition to the steps that I just outlined, we'll be working closely with our partners, and I hope to be able to update this House shortly on some of the measures we are taking in company to try and ensure that sufficient aid gets into Gaza, particularly over this vital winter period.
Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The ICC arrest warrants are welcome, but in themselves will not bring an end to Israeli war crimes and ethnic cleansing and the killing of innocent men, women and children. It is an international legal obligation on the UK government to prevent ethnic cleansing and to prevent genocide. Will the Minister explain what specific measures the government has and is taking to stop Israel's ethnic cleansing in northern Gaza? And will he explain what concrete steps the UK government has taken to comply with the Genocide Convention?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The honourable member asked about northern Gaza and some of the specific measures that have been taken. As I said in answer to a previous question, we have been paying close attention to events in northern Gaza. By way of example, we watched closely with horror the events at Kamal Addan Hospital. I raised this myself repeatedly with the Israeli authorities and urged them to preserve life at that hospital, including with the children. We take every opportunity to underline to the Israelis their responsibilities as an occupying power in the whole of Gaza, but in northern Gaza in particular, and indeed the obligations that fall to them, Madam Deputy Speaker, in relation to medical facilities, and particularly where there is ongoing treatment of children, as there was in that case. I recognise the honourable member's frustration about the situation in northern Gaza. We are clear, northern Gaza must not be cut off from the south. There must be no forcible transfer of Gazans from or within Gaza, nor any reduction in the territory of the Gaza Strip. The government of Israel must minimise evacuation notices to only areas where it's military necessary, provide timely and consistent information on when and where they take effect, and be clear on where it is safe for civilians to move to. The polio vaccination rollout has now ended, but an estimated 6,800 to 13,700 children in northern Gaza were not reached due to intense IDF activity. This is deplorable. Delayed vaccination of any child in Gaza puts them at risk and is unacceptable, and we make these points to the Israelis. I recognise the members' frustration. We are doing what we can to try and ensure that children and others in northern Gaza have access to the aid that they need.
Dan Aldridge.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So many of my constituents have written to me and to express their horror at what is happening in Gaza. Does the Minister agree with me that UNRWA plays an indispensable role in the provision of humanitarian assistance, and does he oppose the bills recently passed in the Knesset that would prevent UNRWA's operation? Thank you.
I thank the honourable member, Madam Deputy Speaker, for passing on the concerns of his constituents, which I know is felt right across the country, and that many members would wish to put on record the concern of their constituents as well. I do condemn the the Knesset bill in relation to UNRWA. We've made this point clear. UNRWA is indispensable. Only UNRWA can provide the aid at the scale required into the occupied Palestinian territories, and we will continue to press for UNRWA's continued operation in accordance with the relevant Security Council resolutions.
Clive Jones.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is crucial that the Labour government must comply with our obligations under international law to uphold the ICC's ruling and enforce the arrest warrants against Israeli ministers. This compliance is vital, given the previous Conservative government's besmirching of the International Criminal Court and in turn damaging the UK's standing on the world stage. Many of my constituents in Wokingham would like to see that the UK stands up for what is right and would like to see that the UK does not turn its back on international law. So will the Secretary of State confirm that the government will not undermine the ICC's ruling by unequivocally agreeing to uphold the arrest warrants?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to reassure the honourable member and ask him to pass on to his constituents that this government will indeed do the right thing and stand up for international law, and I've set out the manner in which we would do that over the course of this afternoon.
Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the government's commitment to uphold its obligations under international law and therefore to commit to issuing arrest warrants to these men if they step foot on British soil. But I do ask the Minister, if the government acknowledges that the Prime Minister of Israel should be on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity, how, morally and legally, can we continue to supply him with the weapons which are being used by Israel in its horrific assault on innocent civilians in Gaza?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've outlined our position both in relation to our international and domestic obligations to the ICC, and I've outlined the position on arms sales. I can reassure my honourable friends that we consider the findings of the ICC in the ongoing review process in relation to arms sales.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I say I'm truly perplexed? No doubt most of the British population that's watching this debate will be truly perplexed by some of the arguments that are being advanced. Issues when it comes to the ICC, topics such as morality or equivalence, don't feature. This is a principle of law, an independent body encapsulating some of the most senior members of the judiciary have made a finding, and yet we have issues of democracy or morality being used as some sort of impunity against leaders. Will the Minister state that if Benjamin Netanyahu arrived on these shores, even if the ICC have issued warrants, would we at least detain him subject to our domestic procedures?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the member makes a impassioned and welcome commitment to due process and the independence of the law, and I won't demur from that by providing commentary on what domestic courts might do in a hypothetical situation.
Yuan Yang.
I'm frankly astonished at the principle underlining some of the comments made by the Shadow Foreign Secretary and some of her Conservative colleagues today. I've been giving assemblies to primary school children across Early and Woodley constituency, emphasising that British democracy means that nobody is above the rule of law. Yeah. I hope that one day the members of the Conservative Party opposite might understand what the children of Early and Woodley constituency instinctively understand, which is that we should be equal above the law, whether or not we are the political leaders of a democracy or otherwise. And that is why I welcome the Minister's statement that the government will comply with its international obligations. Now, the Minister has set out the work he has been doing in travelling to the region and in witnessing firsthand the blockage of aid by the Israeli government into Gaza. The United Nations states that over 83% of food aid has been blocked. And of course, this leads to the risk, an ongoing fact of starvation in the region. So I ask the Minister what he can do, what the government can do, in line with our positive obligation under international law to prevent future atrocities occurring in Gaza.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. the government is deeply concerned by the latest IPC finding about the situation in relation to food insecurity in Gaza. We are making efforts to try and ensure that a more rapid and regular flow of aid, including items that have been barred. Those items that have been barred seem to particularly often be the items most vital for winterisation, as the international humanitarian community call it, in Gaza, and we will continue to press for more flexibility on these points, so the necessary tents, sleeping bags and other equipment required to safeguard Palestinian life over the course of the winter is able to move in at the scale that is required.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Having seen and lived through in Northern Ireland the misuse of lawfare, whereby the terrorist uses law to target those who seek to live by the law, and terrorists ignores the premise that every one of their actions are illegal, I very firmly oppose the UK stamp of approval on any ICC decision on Israel. It is only when you, and not you the Minister, but you, me, have been the victim in Northern Ireland, as unionists have, of the whitewashing propaganda, that you truly understand the danger. Will the Minister not recall that Israel has been defending itself under perpetual attack, and that this ICC ruling is simply affirming the Hamas agenda of hiding terrorism behind women and children and sacrificing them to achieve their goal, which is clear, to wipe Israel off the map? And this is something that we can never support. I hope the Minister will never support it either.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I do not support the actions of Hamas. I condemn them outright and utterly. The actions of Hamas, the continued keeping of hostages in unspeakable cruelty, both to the Israeli people but indeed to British nationals as well. And we do not forget Emily Damari, still held more than a year since she was taken. That being said, we can both condemn terrorist organisations like Hamas, like Lebanese Hezbollah, and also encourage our allies to stand to the very highest standards, and our commitment to international law is part of that contribution.
Laura Kirk-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've just returned from the West Bank, where I met with Roland Friedrich, Director of UNRWA Affairs, and saw UNRWA's work firsthand, which in the West Bank alone includes running 97 schools, 43 health centres, and providing public services like clean drinking water and rubbish collection. Does the Minister agree that there is no viable alternative to UNRWA, and will he do everything in his power to ensure that Israel allows its vital operations to continue?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I do agree there is no alternative to UNRWA, and we will raise these points both directly with Israel and in company. It is vital that UNRWA, underpinned by a succession of UN Security Council resolutions, is able to continue its vital work both in West Bank and in Gaza and across the wider region.
Richard Quigley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can the Minister reassure us that he and other ministers have directly pressed Israel on compliance with international humanitarian law in their meetings with their counterparts?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I can, and I did this morning, and I will continue to do so.
Peter Prinsley.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Emily is a British citizen, held hostage, as the Minister has said, ever since these attacks. Would the Minister explain what measures the government is taking to make contact with those holding the hostages so that we can bring Emily home?
Madam Deputy Speaker, hostage cases are some of the most horrifying situations that a family could face. A year on, the agony that Emily's family feel, and I know many people in this House have met with her family and have seen firsthand the bravery but also the agony that faces them all. I regret deeply that the best chance of release for all of the hostages is a negotiated agreement, and I call on all parties to come back to the table in order to try and advance the agreement necessary to secure a release of hostages, an immediate ceasefire, and a reduction in the awful violence that scars us all.
We now move on to the statement, and I'll give a few moments for the front benches to settle.